Picture this, if you will. Dawn breaking over the Chiricahua Mountains in 1870, the kind of sunrise that makes the desert rocks glow like embers. Young Apache girls are stirring awake on their fourth day of the sunrise ceremony, their faces painted with sacred white clay that catches the first light. The medicine women's voices rise and fall in songs so ancient they seem to emerge from the mountains themselves, songs that have echoed through these canyons for more generations than anyone can count. Among these girls stands someone who would become legendary, Lozan, sister to the great Chief Victorio. Now, here's where history gets genuinely fascinating. Lozan possessed what her people called a gift. She could feel the approach of enemies through tingling sensations in her palms. Imagine that for a moment. In a world where survival depended on knowing who was coming over the next ridge, this woman carried an early warning system in her very hands. And before you dismiss this as mere superstition, consider that countless Apache warriors trusted their lives to Lozan's abilities. That's the kind of trust you don't place lightly. But let's step back and understand what we're really talking about here. Apache women weren't living some romanticized frontier existence. These were women who could weave baskets so tightly they held water without leaking. Think about the mathematical precision required for that feat. They knew exactly when and where to gather mescal hearts in spring, timing the harvest to the day when the desert agave plants contained maximum nutrition. Picture them moving through landscapes that would kill an unprepared traveler in hours, reading the desert like we read street signs. The complexity of their lives would astound us today. Apache women maintained elaborate networks of food caches hidden throughout the desert, a supply chain that would make modern logistics experts envious. They taught their daughters not just to survive, but to thrive in one of North America's most challenging environments. A young Apache woman needed to know which rocks indicated underground springs, how to predict weather patterns by reading cloud formations over specific peaks, and how to prepare dozens of different desert plants for food and medicine. Think about the sheer knowledge base required. These women were walking encyclopedias of botanical information, meteorology, geography, and pharmaceutical science. They could identify edible plants that looked identical to poisonous ones, distinguish between dozens of different grass seeds, and locate underground water sources by observing the behavior of birds and insects. As American settlers began pushing westward in greater numbers, Apache women found their role evolving in ways that challenge everything we think we know about frontier warfare. They weren't camp followers or helpless dependents. They became essential strategists in their people's resistance. When warriors rode out on raids, it was Apache women who managed the complex supply lines through secret canyon routes, moving food and ammunition along paths only they knew. And here's something that might surprise you. When cornered, Apache women fought with a ferocity that terrified their enemies. Take Guyen, whose story reads like something from an action film, except it's absolutely true. When Comanche raiders killed her husband, Guyen didn't sit in mourning. She tracked the war party alone, infiltrated their camp in the dead of night, killed her husband's murderer with his own knife, and returned home carrying his scalp. We're talking about a woman who pulled off what amounts to a solo military operation behind enemy lines. Then there's Dilth Clehen, Geronimo's wife, who could shoot as accurately as any warrior in her band. These weren't exceptions. They were examples of what Apache culture expected from its women when survival was at stake. The line between warrior and non-combatant, simply put, didn't exist in the same way it did in European American society. But here's what made Apache women truly dangerous to the advancing American military: their economic knowledge of the land. They knew where to find water during drought years that could last for months. They understood which plants could sustain a fleeing band when traditional food sources weren't available. They could disappear into landscape features that looked like empty desert to untrained eyes. American military commanders eventually realized something crucial. Breaking the women meant breaking the resistance. It wasn't enough to defeat Apache warriors in battle. As long as the women remained free to maintain their supply networks, treat wounded fighters with traditional medicines, and pass on their encyclopedic knowledge of desert survival, the Apache could continue their resistance indefinitely. This realization led to a strategic shift that would prove devastating. The American military began specifically targeting Apache women and children, understanding that these weren't non-combatants in any meaningful sense. They were the logistical backbone of Apache resistance. Without them, even the most skilled Apache warriors would find themselves cut off from the knowledge and resources that made their desert campaigns possible. The stage was being set for something unprecedented in American military history, a campaign designed not just to defeat an enemy army, but to systematically destroy a people's entire way of life. And at the center of this approaching storm stood women like Lozan, with her supernatural awareness of approaching danger, feeling the tremors of change in her very palms. What none of them could have anticipated was just how complete that change would be. September 8th, 1886. Mark that date in your mind, because it represents the end of freedom as the Apache people had known it for countless centuries. Geronimo's band, 498 people, and here's the crucial detail most histories miss, mostly women and children, surrendered at Skeleton Canyon. These weren't the hardened warriors that American newspapers had been sensationalizing for decades. These were families who had been running for their lives, reduced to eating grass seeds and cactus fruit, their numbers decimated by constant pursuit. The Apache women had negotiated fiercely through interpreters, believing promises that seemed reasonable enough. They would be reunited with their families already imprisoned in Florida. Think about that for a moment. These women were conducting diplomatic negotiations, while their children clung to their skirts, while their men faced the very real possibility of being hanged as war criminals. They extracted what they thought were binding commitments from American military officers who looked them in the eye and gave their word. Instead, they found themselves herded onto trains at Fort Bowie, and here's where the story takes a turn that defies comprehension. Picture the scene. Apache women who had spent their entire lives in landscapes where you could see for 50 miles in any direction, suddenly confined in railroad cars as the iron horse belched black smoke that seemed to swallow their familiar mountains. Tedder, only 8 years old at the time, would later recall how her grandmother gripped her hand so tightly it hurt, whispering prayers to white-painted woman as the train lurched forward into an incomprehensible future. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared these women for what they encountered on that journey east. Through grimy train windows, they witnessed the transformation of their world from the beloved Sonoran Desert to endless grasslands that stretched beyond the horizon, then to forests so thick they blocked out the sky. Imagine women who navigated by reading the shadows of specific mountain peaks, suddenly finding themselves in a world where trees grew so dense you couldn't see 20 feet in any direction. The real shock came when they reached their first major American city. As the train pulled into Fort Worth, Texas, Apache women who had spent their lives under infinite desert sky pressed their faces against windows, staring in absolute disbelief at buildings that literally scraped the clouds. We're talking about structures taller than the sacred peaks of their homeland, filled with more people than existed in their entire tribe, their entire people, their entire world as they understood it. Let me put this in perspective for you. The total Apache population at its peak probably never exceeded 8,000 people spread across the entire Southwest. In Fort Worth alone, these women were seeing more human beings in one place than all the Apache who had ever lived combined. The sheer density of humanity defied every concept they had about how people could exist together. In Apache society, everyone knew everyone else for generations back. Here were thousands of strangers rushing past each other without acknowledgement, without the basic courtesies that had governed human interaction since time immemorial. Some of the women began keening softly, the traditional mourning songs, convinced they were being transported to the land of the dead, and honestly, from their perspective, that wasn't an unreasonable conclusion. Nothing in their cultural framework provided tools for understanding what they were witnessing. The noise alone must have been overwhelming. Steam engines shrieking, factory whistles, the clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestones, vendors shouting in languages they'd never heard. At brief stops along the route, crowds gathered to gawk at the savage prisoners. But here's what's fascinating. While white Americans stared at these women as curiosities, the Apache women were conducting their own anthropological study. They observed bustling streets where people seemed to live in vertical caves, stacked impossibly high. They watched American women corseted so tightly they could barely breathe, bustled and layered in clothing that would have killed them in the desert heat they knew. They saw men in uniforms who clearly weren't warriors. What was a police officer to someone who had never conceived of law enforcement as a separate social function? The economic systems they witnessed must have seemed like elaborate madness. Apache women understood trade, of course, but they were observing a society where people exchanged small metal discs and pieces of paper for survival necessities. In their world, wealth meant knowledge of where to find water and food, the ability to create useful objects with your hands, relationships with people who would share with you in hard times. Here was a civilization that seemed to have divorced survival from any connection to the natural world. And the waste, Apache women who saved every scrap of material, who found uses for every part of every plant and animal they encountered, witnessed a society that threw away more food in a single day than their bands consumed in weeks. They saw people wearing clothes that would be discarded after minimal use, living in structures filled with objects that served no purpose they could identify. Perhaps most disturbing was the isolation. These were women from a culture where leaving someone alone was considered a form of torture, where every major decision was made collectively, where child rearing was a community responsibility. They were observing a society where people lived surrounded by others, yet seemed profoundly alone, where families were reduced to parents and children cut off from the extended networks that made life meaningful. The train journey continued eastward, each mile taking them further from everything they understood about how human beings were supposed to live. The landscape grew increasingly alien. Humid forests where the air itself felt heavy, rivers so wide you couldn't see the opposite bank, cities that sprawled beyond comprehension. And through it all, the iron horse kept moving, carrying them toward a destination that would challenge every assumption they had ever made about the nature of existence itself. By the time they reached the Florida coast, these women had witnessed the full scope of American civilization in all its bewildering complexity. They had seen the future that was swallowing their world, and it was more alien than anything their prophets had ever imagined. The stone fortress waiting for them at Fort Marion would be just the beginning of an education in just how thoroughly one world could consume another. Fort Marion's massive stone walls rose from the Florida swamps like some monstrous grey mountain, and as those gates clanged shut behind them, the Apache women entered a world specifically designed to crush the human spirit. This wasn't just imprisonment. This was psychological warfare conducted through architecture. The ancient Spanish fortress, with its narrow cells carved from solid stone and air so thick with humidity you could barely breathe, became home to nearly 500 Apache prisoners. Within months, something horrifying began happening. The cemetery started filling with Apache dead. We're talking about a mortality rate that would have sparked international outrage if it happened today. Tuberculosis, malaria, pneumonia, dysentery, TACEs, diseases that these desert people had no immunity against swept through the fortress like wildfire. But the official cause of death, listed on many certificates, was something doctors had no name for. Broken hearts. Warriors who had once run 50 miles a day without breaking stride sat listlessly in the humid courtyard, staring at walls that blocked out the sky. Elders who were the living libraries of their people, who carried thousands of years of accumulated wisdom in their memories, gasped their last breaths in this alien humidity, taking entire universes of knowledge with them to their graves. The women watched helplessly as their children's eyes grew dull, as the bright curiosity that had made them race across desert mesas was slowly strangled by stone walls and iron bars. Imagine being a mother who had taught her daughter to read weather patterns in cloud formations, only to watch that same child forget what clouds looked like because she saw sky only through a narrow window for 15 minutes a day. But here's what the American military never understood about Apache women. They were survivors in ways that went far beyond physical endurance. Even in this stone cage designed to break them, they fought a different kind of war. They organized secret gatherings where the old stories were whispered in voices so quiet the guards couldn't hear. They taught children Apache words during the brief moments when supervision lapsed, embedding their language so deeply in young minds that decades later, those children would remember phrases they thought they'd forgotten. Most remarkably, they found ways to conduct healing ceremonies using whatever materials this alien environment provided. When desert sage was forbidden, they learned to burn seaweed and shells, creating sacred smoke from the offerings of an ocean they'd never imagined existed. When they couldn't gather traditional medicinal plants, they experimented with local flora, testing and tasting, and slowly building new pharmacological knowledge that blended ancient wisdom with forced adaptation. The monthly supervised visits to St. Augustine became surreal expeditions into the heart of American civilization. Picture this. Apache women who had lived their entire lives without seeing a building larger than a trading post, suddenly walking streets illuminated by electric lamps, artificial suns that burned without fire, without wood, without any connection to the natural world they understood. They entered shops filled with more manufactured goods than their entire tribe had ever owned collectively, staring at bolts of cloth in colors that didn't exist in nature, at machines whose purpose they couldn't fathom. The cultural shock worked both ways. Apache women observed American women corseted so tightly they couldn't bend at the waist, bustled and layered in clothing that would have been a death sentence in the desert environments they knew. They watched these women navigate social interactions governed by rules so complex and arbitrary, they made Apache ceremonial protocols seem simple by comparison. An American woman couldn't speak to a man without formal introduction, couldn't appear in public without a chaperone, couldn't express opinions on matters deemed beyond her sphere, restrictions that would have baffled Apache women who participated equally in tribal councils and whose opinions on matters of survival were considered essential. Meanwhile, American men stared at the Apache women's free-flowing hair and moccasined feet as if they were observing creatures from another planet. The contrast was stark. Apache women moved with the fluid grace of people who had spent their lives navigating challenging terrain, while fashionable American women hobbled on shoes that served no practical purpose, their movements constrained by clothing designed to display wealth rather than facilitate function. Some entrepreneurial guards discovered they could force the Apache women to pose for tourist photographs at 25 cents each, and these images would later haunt museum collections across the country. Look at those photographs today, and you'll see something heartbreaking. Proud women reduced to curiosities, their eyes reflecting both defiance and despair. They understood exactly what was happening. They were being transformed into symbols of a vanishing race, while they were still very much alive, still fighting for survival in ways their captors couldn't recognize. The photography sessions themselves became a form of resistance. Apache women learned to control their expressions, to reveal nothing of their inner thoughts to the cameras that captured their images for strangers' entertainment. They developed strategies for maintaining dignity while being displayed like specimens, techniques that their descendants would later use when Hollywood came calling with its own form of cultural exploitation. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of their imprisonment was watching their children disappear piece by piece. Boys who had been taught to track rabbits across stone landscapes forgot how to read animal signs. Girls who had learned to identify dozens of edible plants by taste and smell lost the ability to distinguish between foods that could sustain life and those that could kill. The complex oral traditions that had been passed down for generations began to fracture as children spent more time with English-speaking teachers than with their own grandmothers. The Apache women fought this cultural death sentence with every tool at their disposal. They created elaborate systems for preserving knowledge, embedding songs and stories and practical information in seemingly innocent activities. A basket-weaving lesson became a geography class about sacred sites. A cooking demonstration became a pharmacology course about medicinal plants. They turned every interaction with their children into a desperate effort to transmit cultural DNA that could survive even this systematic attempt at erasure. As 1890 approached, these women had witnessed something unprecedented in human history. The complete collision of two fundamentally different ways of understanding existence itself. They had been torn from a world where every rock and tree and stream held spiritual significance and dropped into a universe where nature existed only to be exploited, where relationships between people were mediated by money rather than kinship, where the very concepts of community and family had been redefined beyond recognition. What they couldn't have known was that their struggle to preserve Apache identity in the face of systematic destruction was about to enter an even more challenging phase. By 1894, when some Apache prisoners were finally relocated to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, the mathematics of cultural destruction were starkly clear. A full third of their number lay buried in Florida soil. 500 people had entered Fort Marion 8 years earlier. Fewer than 350 would see the Oklahoma Territory. But here's what's remarkable about the survivors. They carried more than tuberculosis scars and the trauma of watching their people die in an alien land. They bore witness to something unprecedented in human history. The complete collision of two worlds. And from that devastating impact, they somehow forged something entirely new. Women like Dilth Clehen, Geronimo's wife, had learned to do something their grandmothers never could have imagined. They learned to write English letters, but these weren't simple communications. They were carefully crafted narratives that contradicted official government reports, smuggled testimonies that would eventually reach reform groups in Boston and Philadelphia. Think about the strategic brilliance required here. These women, who had been taught to read and write as part of their civilization process, turned that very education into a weapon against the system that imposed it. In letter after letter, they described children torn from their mothers' arms and sent to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, where Apache boys and girls had their hair cut short, their names changed from those given by their families to English equivalents chosen by strangers. They wrote about children who were beaten for speaking Apache, who forgot their own language within months, who returned for brief visits unable to communicate with their own grandparents. These letters, passed secretly through sympathetic teachers and missionaries, began appearing in Eastern newspapers, sparking the first glimmers of public outrage over what we would now recognize as systematic cultural genocide. But the most surreal chapter in this ongoing collision of worlds came during the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri. Picture this if you can. Geronimo, now an old man, and several Apache women were transported to the fair to be displayed in a mock village, where they demonstrated traditional crafts and way of life for fairgoers who had paid 50 cents to see wild Indians in their natural habitat. The irony was staggering. People who had been imprisoned for Nearly 2 decades were now performing authenticity for audiences who had no idea what authentic Apache life actually looked like. Between scheduled demonstrations of basket weaving and hide tanning, the Apache women had the opportunity to observe the fair's vision of American progress. They walked through exhibitions showcasing electric lights that turned night into day, moving pictures that captured life itself and played it back, and machines that seemed to accomplish work without human effort. The World's Fair was designed to showcase humanity's triumph over nature, technology's dominance over traditional ways of life, civilization's victory over what organizers called savage existence. Yet these Apache women, who were supposed to represent the vanishing past, recognized something the fair's organizers missed entirely: opportunity. They charged visitors $1 for personal photographs, e.s. 4 times the admission price for their own exhibition. They sold traditional baskets for 10 times what they could get on the reservations, carefully observing which stories made white women reach for their purses with tears in their eyes. They discovered that certain narratives about Apache spirituality and connection to nature resonated powerfully with urban audiences who were beginning to feel disconnected from the natural world themselves. This strategic performance of identity became something remarkable, a survival tool that could be passed to their daughters and granddaughters. Apache women learned to present their culture in ways that satisfied American curiosity while protecting the sacred elements they didn't want exposed to public consumption. They became cultural translators, preserving the essence of Apache identity while adapting its expression to survive in an American context. The fair also provided something unexpected: perspective on just how much American society had changed since their first shocking encounters with cities during their train journey east in 1886. The America they observed in 1904 was already beginning to question some of its own assumptions about progress and civilization. Reform movements were emerging that challenged industrial exploitation, environmental destruction, and the treatment of indigenous peoples. Apache women found themselves inadvertently positioned at the center of a national conversation about what America wanted to become. But perhaps most importantly, they recognized that their survival strategy couldn't depend on remaining frozen in time as museum exhibits. The children and grandchildren growing up in this new world would need different tools than those that had sustained their ancestors in the desert. Apache women began the complex work of cultural translation, determining which elements of traditional knowledge could be preserved, which needed to be adapted, and which new skills their descendants would need to navigate American society while maintaining their Apache identity. The results of this strategic adaptation can be seen today in ways that would astonish those fair visitors from 1904. When Apache women like Fort Sill Apache Tribe Chairwoman Lori Goodey Ware walk the halls of Congress advocating for tribal rights, they carry briefcases filled with legal documents while wearing traditional jewelry that connects them to their ancestors. When Dr. Jessica Stego teaches Apache language classes at Arizona State University, she uses PowerPoint presentations to preserve and transmit the oral traditions that survived Fort Marion and Carlisle. When young Apache women document their culture through social media platforms from apartments in New York City and Los Angeles, they're employing the same strategic performance skills their great-grandmothers developed at the World's Fair. They are no longer prisoners gazing through train windows at an incomprehensible American civilization. They have become sovereign people who learned to navigate both worlds without losing their souls, who discovered that cultural survival required not just preservation but constant, strategic reinvention. The ghosts that refuse to die aren't the romanticized spirits of a vanishing race. They're the living, breathing, evolving traditions carried forward by women who understood that the only way to honor their ancestors was to ensure their descendants could thrive in whatever world they inherited. The Apache women, who once felt enemy approach through tingling in their palms, have taught their descendants to feel the pulse of opportunity in a complex modern world. to recognize which battles are worth fighting and which transformations are necessary for survival. Their story isn't one of cultural death and resurrection, it's the ongoing saga of a people who refused to let conquest define their destiny, who turned even imprisonment into a classroom for learning how to navigate between worlds while remaining fundamentally, unshakably Apache.